Good evening and thank you for joining us on You and Your Money. I'm Bryan Hirsch. Our discussion this evening centres on the investment world to identify opportunity, assess risks and strategies for navigating today's markets. I was reading the Financial Mail this weekend and came across an article by Simon Brown entitled Things Worth Remembering. David, you were mentioned in a reference to a time many years ago when you were asked about resource stocks and when commodity prices might turn higher and drive up mining shares. As investors, we are often influenced by headlines and numbers. With the South African market now at all-time highs, my question is, what has driven this performance and do you believe it's likely to continue? And in addition, could you also please comment on the rest of the market that has not performed as well and share your outlook for the future?
You're talking the SA market, Bryan. It's been quite remarkable to see what has driven this market up. And it's a bit of a paradox because the South African economy is battling along, and yet we're in record highs on the local market. And a lot of it has been driven by gold shares. And I mean, there have been outstanding performances of both Anglo Gold and Gold Fields. I mention those two because they're big influences of the index. Other gold shares, Durban Deep, Pan African, have all done well as well as Harmony. But I think those two, Gold Fields and Anglo Gold, have had a big influence on the top end of the market. And then, of course, we've had the recovery in Tencent, and that's driven up Naspers and Process, and then a few other companies contributed as well. British American Tobacco, also a big contributor to the gains that we've seen in the index. Those companies do not operate in South Africa. They have no operations, not even, I mean, Tencent, certainly not, British American Tobacco, and the gold miners, even though it's Anglo Gold, I think Gold Fields has a small gold operation, it has South Deep, but I mean, by and large, their operations are outside. Take that away, Bryan, if we go down to the retail. In fact, even if we go to the diversified miners, they haven't done spectacularly. They've underperformed the index. Also, your retailers, your banks, all of those local businesses, those companies that operate within the South African economy are actually underperformers and haven't done much. This can continue. We're getting a lot of stories about bubbles forming. I'm talking globally, not necessarily the South African market. But for the meantime, I think, this trend can continue, Bryan. I don't see anything that's going to bring it to an abrupt halt at the moment.
David, this is a significant week in the United States with possible interest rates being cut and expectations of what may happen with inflation. Where markets have also reached new highs. And where do you see this going from here?
It's very interesting. I try to follow the debate because this week the Fed meets and it's almost baked in, 90% plus, that the Fed will cut rates. Bryan, we also have to explain in the Fed Reserve is governed by two mandates. The one is inflation and the other is employment. And they're in contrast because even though inflation has come down, it hasn't come down to the 2% level that the Fed would like. And it's hovering between 2 and 3%. Nothing's happened. There's no dramatic moves in there, but it's it's very sticky there. On the other hand, employment is starting to show signs of weakening. And I think that's what's going to influence the Fed to start reducing rates. But there's still debate as to how many rate cuts we'll get. Now we come into the political argument because the market's saying it's going to be between 2 and 3. So this is important. The market says 2 to 3. Why? Because Steve Mirren, who is an appointee by Trump, I think he could be passed by the Senate and become a governor soon. And I think there are other governors within the Fed Reserve who are also very dovish and are also trying to curry favor with Trump so that they could be the next chair, which is, in other words, replace Powell. So you've got a lot of political ramification. The market says, okay, if this does happen, you're going to get a dovish Fed emerging. Dovish means in favor of reducing rates, which has been the pressure that Trump has been putting on Powell. He wants lower rates because higher rates means that the Treasury are going to pay a lot more for debt, and it becomes more expensive at a time where there is a lot of concern about American debt and American deficits. So those are all the ramifications. What does it mean for us as investors? If rates go down, it's good for markets. And we'll see this week, and we'll hear what Mr. Powell has to say about the outlook for the future.
David, any chance that we get a bigger rate cut than 0.25%?
Yes, oh yeah, they might front load it. In other words, you might get a 50-point cut. It's not out of the question. The market is banking on 25 points, but you might find them giving you 50 points. There could be a worry around that because people will take a step back and say, oi, this is a bit of a worry. The economy is weaker than we think. So, there are a lot of ifs and buts and so on. And this is all the debate that is going on at the moment. It's just a lot of guesswork as well. A lot of, people with their own theories and that. But I think, Bryan, once we get into once we start getting into rates coming down, of course, that's always going to be good for growth and good for for the economy and good for markets.
Well, it may be good for markets, but South Africans who may be pricing in the value of their portfolios offshore and seeing increases when they convert back to rands, they're now saying, oi, what's going on here? David, since our last program together, the rand has strengthened significantly against the dollar. Now, where do you see the dollar heading, and what impact is likely to have on the rand? Because if you talk about American interest rates coming down, doesn't it weaken the dollar?
Yes. That's why the dollar has been so weak. Look, it started some time ago where it was felt that the dollar was overpriced. Trump's tariff policies, the huge debt that he has undertaken with his big, beautiful bill, all these issues, tariff policies, all the uncertainties that populate our headlines every day, not only in financial newspapers, but in global newspapers, all of those issues have encouraged other investors to look elsewhere. And that's why gold has gone up. That's why the pound has improved. That's why the euro has improved. Swiss franc, all of those against the dollar, and continue to do so. We're coming to it's starting to flatline at the moment. It's not being pushed up higher. It's the same way as the rand has kind of reached 7.35, 17.35 against the dollar. It might hover around there, but I don't think this has ended as well. I wouldn't call an end to the rand strength at the moment or to gold's increase at the moment. But all of this has to do with the dollar. Bryan, I do want to point out another thing. The currency markets and the bond markets, those are the fixed interest markets, have a completely different dynamic to the equity market. The equity market, strangely enough, is much more stable. It's not influenced by the same dynamics that hurt the bond market and the currencies market. They're much more volatile. Even though we think that the equity markets are volatile, but to read the dollar, you must look at the bond markets and those currency markets. That's where you're going to get clues, rather than say the equity market.
David, and just coming back to our G20, why do you think it's so important for Trump or Vance to attend this G20 conference?
Well, they don't think it's important. Trump's completely snubbing South Africa. And I think this has to do with more personal relationships. I don't think it has anything to do with financial considerations, or it's just he's being very stubborn. He doesn't get on well with the country. His political views. His views on the property law. His views on crime, corruption, and farm murders, and so on. So I think he's taken to snub it. Does it mean anything? I don't. I'm not quite sure. Vance will come out, but he hasn't got the power. He hasn't got the same kind of heft that Trump has. And also, I don't think Trump wants to be involved in discussions around climate change and so on. So I think this is just a personal spat between America and South Africa. We know the background, the friends that we've chosen, and other issues around that. So, unfortunately,
David, I can tell you what annoys me immensely is the amount of work being done around the Sandton area and other parts where this conference will take place. What about our infrastructure? What about the rest of the country? I mean, we did this in 2010 when we had the World Cup. We got everything looking so great. We took people who were begging on the side of the roads off the roads, and now we're doing it again. But David, on the 26th of October, a decision will be made regarding South Africa's grey listing. I find it puzzling that we've been able to convince the authorities that money laundering and corruption are under control. What is your view on this?
Well, they're not under control. But the thing is that we'll probably comply with all the regulations that they set down. In other words, we'll tick the boxes. But I think it's a matter of whether we put this into practice. And I'm not sure that has been fully complied with from that point of view. So we'll still be measured over time. I'm also surprised that we're getting off so lightly. But listen, the banks have done a lot to get the country off the grey list. Whether they stick to it or not, and whether they're able to make controls internally, that's going to be the question, Bryan. But I still think investors will look at us with suspicion and caution, simply because our crime stats are so high. As you mentioned, I think there's so many other things that are happening in the country or could be improved in that. So despite the fact that we get off the list, yes, it may be cheaper and it might allow some people to come through, I still think there's going to be a lot of skepticism about us. It's going to take a long time for us to really get off that list.
If we do get off the list, what impact will that have both on the Rand and the South African market?
I don't think much. My view is, listen, we're strengthening with or without it. That's the irony, is that we've come back from close to 19. Look, that was at the time of Trump's tariffs and Liberation Day and so on. We've come back quite strongly, and the dollar continues to fall. But I don't think it's going to have much impact. We won't see it. It comes more from banks dealing with counterparts on the other side or elsewhere out of the country, and where there probably will be some form of saving on that. But I don't know whether it's going to be a big event. It'll make headlines for a day, but for most people, it's just, okay, let's move on.
David, when we come back, I want to talk about the latest quarter's GDP numbers, but we're going to take a break. Stay tuned, and we'll be back shortly.